There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around in their heads, and that version is wrong in a very specific way. It is not wrong because the facts have been hidden, though many have been. It is not wrong because the photographs were censored, though many were. It is wrong because the entire framework through which the war was explained to the American public was constructed to serve institutional needs that had nothing to do with winning, with truth, or with the lives of the men who were sent there. The misunderstanding people speak of when they discuss Vietnam was not an accident of incomplete information. It was the product of a system that had learned very early that the appearance of progress was more valuable than progress itself, and that the people doing the reporting and the people doing the dying were, in most cases, not the same people. This matters because the story of Vietnam is still told in popular memory and in official history as a tragedy of good intentions, of a war that was misunderstood, of a military that fought bravely against impossible circumstances, of a government that made strategic miscalculations. That framing is not false, but it obscures something more fundamental, which is that the war was also misrepresented, deliberately and continuously, at every level of the chain of command, and that this misrepresentation was not a deviation from institutional norms, but had, by the mid-1960s, become the norm itself. The gap between what was reported and what was real was not a flaw in the system. It was a feature that the system had learned to depend on. To understand how that happened, you have to go back before the large-scale American commitment, back to the early years when American advisors first arrived in South Vietnam in significant numbers, and when the logic that would come to define the entire war began to take shape. The South Vietnamese government under Ngo Dinh Diem was corrupt, autocratic, and deeply unpopular in large parts of the country. American officials knew this. Cables from the embassy in Saigon said as much with considerable clarity in the late 1950s and early 60s. The question was not whether the Diem government was flawed. The question was whether that assessment, if taken seriously, would complicate the broader commitment that Washington was already making to the idea of a non-communist South Vietnam. It would, and so the assessment was not taken seriously. This is the first pattern, and it repeats at every subsequent level of the war. Information that confirmed the chosen policy was elevated, circulated, and cited. Information that challenged the chosen policy was downgraded, reframed, or quietly buried. This was not always a conscious decision made by individuals who knew they were lying. More often it was an institutional reflex, a way of processing information that had been rewarded so consistently that it had become invisible. You reported what was useful. You minimized what was inconvenient. You learned very quickly, if you were an officer in the field or an analyst at a desk, that your career prospects were closely tied to the coherence between your reports and the expectations of the people above you. The Americans who were sent to advise South Vietnamese units in those early years found themselves navigating a system designed to produce false positives. South Vietnamese commanders reported victories that had not happened, body counts that had been inflated, territory secured that was not secure. They did this partly because they had learned that the Americans responded well to positive reporting, and partly because the culture of the South Vietnamese military had developed its own economy of false information, one that allowed commanders to avoid difficult operations by reporting that those operations had already been successfully conducted. American advisors who understood what was happening and said so clearly found themselves marginalized, reassigned, or simply ignored. American advisors who learned to work within the system, to read the reports with the appropriate level of skepticism while still forwarding them up the chain, found that their careers proceeded normally. By the time the first large American combat units arrived in Vietnam in 1965, this pattern was already deeply embedded. What changed with the arrival of American ground troops was not the underlying dynamic, but the scale. Now the Americans were not just advising, but fighting, and the same institutional logic that had distorted South Vietnamese reporting began to distort American reporting as well. the measure of success that the military adopted, partly out of genuine analytical conviction and partly because it was the measure that produced the most manageable data, was the body count. If you could not hold territory, if the political situation was deteriorating, if the South Vietnamese government remained corrupt and unpopular, you could still demonstrate progress by counting bodies. The enemy was losing more men than it could replace. The attrition was working. The war was being won. The problem with the body count was not simply that it was often inaccurate, though it was. The problem was more fundamental. The body count as a metric assumed a static enemy with a finite and known pool of replacements. The North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front were neither static nor operating from a finite pool. They were drawing on a population that had been mobilized through a combination of genuine nationalist sentiment and coercion to an extent that American planners consistently underestimated. They were receiving supplies and reinforcements through channels that American airpower could degrade but not sever, and they were fighting a war whose primary logic was not attrition but endurance, a war in which losing battles repeatedly, at terrible cost, was still compatible with winning as long as the enemy eventually lost the will to continue. This was not a secret. The basic strategic logic of the North Vietnamese position was understood, at least in the abstract, by many of the Americans involved in the war. What was not understood, or not accepted, was its implication, which was that the war as it was being fought could not be won within any politically acceptable time frame. To accept that implication was to accept that the entire enterprise was misconceived, and that was an acceptance that the institution was not capable of making because the institution had already invested too much in lives and money and political capital to acknowledge a fundamental error. So instead the institution continued, and as it continued, the gap between the reported reality and the lived reality of the men in the field grew wider. A soldier in the Mekong Delta in 1967 knew things that the official briefings at MACV headquarters did not contain. He knew that the villages his unit had supposedly pacified were not pacified. He knew that the body counts submitted after engagements were not accurate. He knew that the Vietnamese civilians in the areas where he operated ranged from indifferent to hostile, and that the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had become, in practice, something very different from what it was in theory. He knew all of this, and he also knew that reporting it accurately through official channels would accomplish nothing except possibly making his immediate superiors uncomfortable. The psychological effect of this knowledge, accumulated over months of deployment, was not simply cynicism, though cynicism was part of it. It was something more corrosive, a gradual erosion of the frameworks through which the soldier understood his own actions and their meaning. If the reports were false, then what was the relationship between what he was doing and what was being said about what he was doing? If the metrics were meaningless, then what did his daily risk and occasional violence actually mean in the larger context of the war? If the civilians in the villages he moved through could not be distinguished from the enemy, then what were the rules of engagement actually protecting, and what were they actually permitting? These were not questions that the institution provided answers to. The institution provided procedures, rules of engagement, after-action report formats, and a chain of command that discouraged upward transmission of uncomfortable realities. It did not provide a framework for understanding what it meant to conduct operations in an environment where almost nothing worked the way the doctrine said it should. The men in the field developed their own frameworks, improvised and provisional, often contradictory, maintained through the close social bonds of the small unit and the shared understanding that official explanations were not to be taken at face value. The base camps that dotted South Vietnam in the years of peak American involvement were, in one sense, islands of institutional order within a landscape of institutional disorder. They had perimeters and guard posts and regulations. They had supply chains and maintenance schedules and morning formations. They had the physical infrastructure of a functioning military presence. But they also contained, within their perimeters, the accumulated contradictions of the entire enterprise. Men rotated in from the field, where reality was one thing, and returned to a world of briefings and reports, where reality was something else. Officers moving between the two registers learned to maintain a kind of double consciousness, one language for the field and another for the reports, one understanding of what was happening and another for what was officially said to be happening. The captured documents that American units occasionally recovered from enemy positions were a particular source of this kind of dissonance. A map found inside a base that had been overrun or in a cache uncovered by a patrol sometimes revealed a picture of the operational environment that was radically at odds with the official American understanding of it. Enemy units that were supposed to have been destroyed were represented as active. Territory that was supposed to have been secured was marked as contested or controlled by the other side. Supply routes that air power was supposed to have interdicted were shown as functional. Civilian populations in areas designated as supportive of the South Vietnamese government were marked as sympathetic to the National Liberation Front. These documents did not disappear. They were collected, translated, analyzed by intelligence units, and forwarded up the chain. What happened to them after that varied. Some became the basis for revised operational assessments. Some were cited in briefings as evidence of enemy capabilities. And some, particularly those whose contents were most incompatible with the current optimistic narrative, were filed, summarized in ways that softened their implications, or simply allowed to recede into the accumulating mass of intelligence data that the system generated faster than it could process. The gap between what the captured documents showed and what the official assessment said was not, in most cases, the result of deliberate deception at any single point. It was the result of a process in which information was transformed, at each stage of its journey from the field to the briefing room, by the institutional pressures that acted on the people handling it. An analyst who wrote an assessment that directly contradicted the commander's current operational assumptions would find his assessment questioned, revised, or returned for reconsideration. Not necessarily because anyone was telling him to lie, but because the system had a gravitational pull toward coherence with established positions, and that gravitational pull was stronger at most points in the chain than the pull toward accuracy. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which was one of the major American-supported efforts to separate the rural population from the insurgency, provides a clear example of how this dynamic operated at the policy level. The program's theory was straightforward. If you could physically relocate peasants from areas of NLF activity into fortified settlements, you could deny the insurgency its base of popular support and its access to food, recruits, and intelligence. By the metrics the program used to measure itself, it was highly successful. Thousands of hamlets were designated as strategic. Millions of people were resettled, and reports filed by provincial officials and American advisors described the program as proceeding effectively. What was not captured by the metrics was the extent to which the program had generated exactly the kind of grievances that made people receptive to the NLF's message. Peasants who had been removed from ancestral lands, who had been required to pay for the materials used to build their own relocation compounds, who had seen family members killed or imprisoned in the security operations associated with the program, were not neutralized, they were radicalized. The NLF's organizational capacity in the countryside was not reduced by the Strategic Hamlet Program. In many areas it was strengthened, because the program had done the NLF's recruiting work for it. This was known. American officials who traveled through the provinces and talked to people rather than to official reports understood it. Vietnamese officials who were honest about what they were seeing reported it. The Rural Affairs Division of the American Mission in Saigon generated assessments that were considerably darker than the official program statistics. But the program had become, by the early 1960s, a cornerstone of the official American narrative about progress in Vietnam. And that narrative had been transmitted to Congress and to the public in ways that made it very difficult to revise without calling into question the entire basis of American policy. So the program continued, the reports continued, and the gap between the reported reality and the actual situation in the countryside continued to widen. The same logic applied, with variations, to almost every major American program in Vietnam. The Chiu Hoi program, which offered amnesty and rewards to members of the NLF who defected, generated impressive statistics on the number of defectors. It was less successful at generating defectors who had detailed knowledge of NLF operations or who represented significant losses to the enemy's military capability. Many of those who presented themselves as defectors were either low-level individuals whose military value to the NLF was minimal, or were using the program for purposes that had nothing to do with genuine defection. The statistics were real. The significance attributed to them was not. The pacification programs that followed the strategic Hamlet program's collapse operated on similar principles. The Hamlet evaluation system, developed in the mid-1960s as a more rigorous method of assessing the security situation in the countryside, produced a national database of Hamlet-by-Hamlet assessments that could be aggregated into maps and graphs showing the progress of pacification. Province advisors were required to assign numerical ratings to each hamlet in their area on dimensions including security, political development, and economic progress. These ratings were compiled, analyzed, and used to brief senior officials on the overall trajectory of the pacification effort. The problem with the Hamlet evaluation system was not that it was poorly designed, though it had significant methodological weaknesses. The problem was that the people filling out the assessments were operating under the same institutional pressures that distorted reporting throughout the system. A province advisor whose Hamlet rating showed deteriorating security in his area of responsibility was, implicitly, reporting failure, his own failure, and the failure of the South Vietnamese officials he was working with. The institutional response to reports of failure was rarely productive, from the perspective of the person filing the report. It tended to generate additional scrutiny, requests for explanation, and pressure to develop corrective action plans. The path of least resistance was to rate things slightly better than they actually were, to describe contested hamlets as relatively secure, to describe politically weak hamlets as developing satisfactorily. This slight upward bias in individual ratings aggregated across thousands of hamlets and hundreds of reporting officers into a picture of steady if slow pacification progress that was substantially more optimistic than the reality on the ground. Senior officials looking at the Hamlet evaluation system data saw a country that was gradually being brought under government control. The men filing the individual ratings knew, many of them, that the numbers were soft, but each individual inflation was small enough to seem trivial, and the systemic effect was invisible from any individual vantage point. The air war over North Vietnam operated under its own version of the same logic. The bombing campaigns, from Rolling Thunder through to Linebacker, were accompanied by extensive systems for measuring their effects. Sorties flown, targets struck, bridges destroyed, roads cut, trucks seen destroyed on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These numbers were tracked, reported, and cited as evidence of the campaign's effectiveness. Senior officials used them to demonstrate to Congress and to the public that the air war was achieving its objectives. What the numbers did not capture was the resilience and adaptability of the North Vietnamese logistics system. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a fixed infrastructure that could be permanently interdicted by air power. It was a dispersed and continuously evolving network that adapted to damage faster than the damage could be inflicted. When bridges were destroyed, the North Vietnamese used underwater bridges, fords, and pontoon crossings that were harder to target and faster to replace. When roads were cut, they were repaired at night by local labor organized by provincial authorities. When trucks were destroyed, they were replaced from Chinese and Soviet supplies. The trucks seen destroyed by American pilots were real. The conclusion that this was meaningfully degrading the North Vietnamese capacity to supply its forces in the South was, in most periods of the war, not supported by the evidence, though it was regularly asserted by those conducting the campaign. The intelligence community's assessments of the air war's effectiveness were, at various points, significantly more pessimistic than the assessments produced by the military chain of command. Studies produced by CIA analysts and by the Pentagon's own Systems Analysis Office, a group of civilian analysts who had been brought in to provide independent assessments of program effectiveness, consistently found that the bombing was not achieving the military objectives claimed for it. These assessments were not ignored exactly. They were received, discussed, and placed alongside the more optimistic military assessments, and senior officials who wanted to maintain the bombing could cite the military assessments, while officials who wanted to constrain it could cite the analytical ones. The existence of competing assessments provided cover for maintaining policies that a single honest assessment would have been difficult to sustain. The ground war's logic was equally self-referential. The search and destroy operations that defined the American tactical approach in the mid-war years were designed to find and kill enemy forces in sufficient numbers to degrade their ability to operate. The metric of success was the body count. Units that produced high body counts were successful. Commanders who produced high body counts were promoted. The entire system of incentives oriented itself around the production of enemy casualties. The pressure this created for inflated reporting was well understood by everyone in the system. Soldiers who survived firefights and returned to their base camps were required to report the number of enemy killed. In engagements where the enemy had carried away its dead, which was common practice, the number was necessarily an estimate. The incentive structure rewarded high estimates. Officers who wanted high numbers for their after-action reports asked for high numbers and received them. Over time, the culture of particular units and particular commands established informal norms for what constituted an acceptable body count relative to the intensity of an engagement, and individual reports were shaped to conform to those norms rather than to the actual count. The consequence was a progressive detachment of the official casualty statistics from any reliable relationship to actual enemy deaths. Intelligence analysts who tried to reconcile the reported body counts with other indicators of enemy strength, including prisoner testimony, captured documents, and enemy order of battle estimates, found the numbers didn't add up. The enemy was supposedly losing men faster than it could replace them. But the enemy's operational capability was not declining in a manner consistent with that rate of loss. Either the body counts were inflated, which they were, or the enemy's replacement capacity had been drastically underestimated, which it had also been. Both things were true simultaneously, and together they had produced a situation in which the central metric of the war's progress was nearly meaningless. The men who served in the infantry during this period understood something that the briefing rooms did not, that the war they were fighting bore almost no relationship to the war being described in official communications, not because they were engaged in anything that could be cleanly described as atrocity, though atrocities occurred and were more widespread than official accounts acknowledged, but because the texture of their daily experience, the ambiguity of the enemy, the ambiguity of the civilian population, the randomness of survival and death in a war without clear fronts or clear objectives, was something that the official language was structurally incapable of conveying. A grunt, humping through the Central Highlands or through the swamped paddies of the Delta, did not think in terms of body counts and pacification ratings. He thought in terms of which step might trigger a mine, which tree line might conceal an ambush, which village's expression indicated potential threat. He thought about the rotation date that would end his tour if he survived to reach it, and about the men in his immediate unit on whose alertness and reliability his survival depended. The war at his level was intensely local, intensely personal, and almost entirely disconnected from the strategic narratives that were being constructed about it elsewhere. This disconnection was not lost on the soldiers themselves. The dark humor that characterized American military culture in Vietnam, the gallows wit that expressed itself in names given to operations and to bases and to the war itself, was partly a coping mechanism and partly a commentary on the absurdity of the institutional situation. Men who had been in country for several months had a clear-eyed view of the gap between official descriptions and their own experience, and they expressed that gap through the only medium available to them, which was informal communication. You believed your own eyes, and you believed the man next to you, and you did not believe the official reports. This was not cynicism for its own sake. It was a rational response to the information environment they actually inhabited. The journalists who covered the war from the field, as opposed to those who covered it from the briefings at MACV, developed a similar orientation. The 5 o'clock follies, as the daily military briefings in Saigon came to be called, had by the mid-1960s acquired a reputation among working journalists as a reliable source of official optimism and an unreliable source of information about what was actually happening. Reporters who went into the field and then attended the briefings were struck repeatedly by the extent to which the two pictures diverged. The briefings described a war that was progressing. The field described a war that was, in most of the places these reporters visited, not progressing in any detectable way. Some of those reporters wrote what they saw. Some of those reports reached American readers and contributed to a growing public skepticism about official accounts of the war. But the institutional response to critical reporting was not to revise the official accounts. It was to question the patriotism and judgment of the reporters, to restrict access, and to cultivate relationships with reporters who produced more favorable coverage. The system had tools for managing its image that were independent of its ability to manage the underlying reality, and it used them. The village of Ben Suk had a population of several thousand people in January 1967, when American forces arrived as part of Operation Cedar Falls. The village was in an area known as the Iron Triangle, a region northwest of Saigon that had been an NLF stronghold for years. The military's assessment was that the village was so thoroughly integrated into the NLF's infrastructure that it could not be pacified by conventional means. The decision was made to destroy it. The population was forcibly relocated to a refugee camp. The village was bulldozed, the area was defoliated. It was a decisive action in the military's terms, a clearing of the board in a contested region. What it accomplished, strategically, was considerably less clear. The people who had been relocated from Ben Suk did not become supporters of the Saigon government. The NLF's capacity to operate in the Iron Triangle was disrupted temporarily, then resumed. The area continued to be contested. The operation generated approximately 6,000 new refugees who were now housed in a camp with inadequate food, water and sanitation, who had lost their homes, their land, and in some cases their family members, and who had acquired a detailed personal understanding of what American military power meant in practice. Ben Suk was one village. Operations of similar character, varying in scale and in the degree of destruction involved, were conducted throughout the war in areas designated as free fire zones, denied areas, or enemy-controlled territory. The free fire zone concept deserves particular attention because it illustrates how official policy created conditions that were then incompatible with the official values the policy claimed to uphold. A free fire zone was an area from which civilians had supposedly been evacuated and within which any individual present could therefore be presumed to be an enemy and engaged without prior clearance. The theory was administratively tidy. The practice was not. The evacuations that created free fire zones were often incomplete, voluntary in theory but coerced in practice, and conducted under conditions that left substantial numbers of civilians unable or unwilling to leave. People who remained in their ancestral lands, who refused to be relocated, who had nowhere to go, or who returned to check on abandoned crops and property, found themselves in areas where they could legally be killed by any American unit that encountered them. The rules of engagement, as applied in free fire zones, produced a situation in which the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had been administratively abolished in large portions of the country. This was not described that way in official communications. It was described as a system for protecting civilians by removing them from areas of military operations. But the practical effect, for the people still present in those areas when American or South Vietnamese forces moved through them, was something quite different. And the practical effect, for the soldiers operating in those areas, was a loosening of the constraints that distinguished legitimate military action from something else. The events at My Lai in March 1968 were extreme in scale. They were not extreme in kind. The systematic killing of civilians, the destruction of villages, the burning of crops and livestock, the treatment of the rural population as collectively responsible for insurgent activity, these were not behaviors invented at My Lai. They were behaviors that had been developing throughout the war in response to an environment where the enemy was invisible. The civilian population was indistinguishable from the enemy. The institutional incentives rewarded body counts rather than discrimination, and the official reporting system provided neither the language nor the structure for accurately describing what was actually happening in the field. What made My Lai unusual was not what happened there, but that it became known. The Army's initial investigation concluded that the reports were exaggerated, and the killing that had occurred was justified by the combat situation. It was a reporter named Seymour Hersh, working independently and publishing through a small news service, who brought the story to public attention more than a year after the events. The subsequent investigation and trial of Lieutenant William Calley produced a picture of what had happened that was shattering to the official narrative, not because the events were unprecedented, but because they were documented with enough specificity to be undeniable. The reaction to My Lai within the military establishment was complicated in ways that are still not fully worked through. There was genuine horror among officers who had served honorably and who saw the events as an aberration. There was also, in other quarters, a closing of ranks, a resistance to broader inquiry, and a tendency to frame the events as the product of individual failure rather than institutional pathology. The court-martial focused on Calley. The question of how My Lai had been possible, what training, what culture, what operational environment, what command climate had made it possible, received considerably less systematic attention. The answer to that question, if pursued honestly, would have required acknowledging that the conditions that produced My Lai were not confined to Charlie Company in Quang Ngai Province on March 16, 1968. Those conditions, in varying degrees and with varying effects, characterized the war throughout the period of peak American involvement. The men who did not massacre villages, which was the overwhelming majority of American soldiers, were nevertheless operating in an environment shaped by the same institutional logic, the same ambiguity about who was the enemy, the same metrics that measured success in bodies rather than in outcomes, the same official language that bore an increasingly tenuous relationship to what they were actually experiencing. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is often described as a turning point in the war, and it was, but not primarily for the military reasons usually cited. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the North Vietnamese and the NLF. The popular uprising in the South that the offensive was supposed to trigger did not materialize. The NLF's military infrastructure in the South, built up painstakingly over years, was devastated in the fighting and took years to rebuild. General Giap himself later acknowledged that the military costs were severe and that the political objectives of the offensive were not achieved in the manner planned. What Tet accomplished was something different and, from the American perspective, more consequential. It demonstrated, conclusively and publicly, the falsity of the official narrative that had been constructed around the war's progress. For months before Tet, senior American officials had been telling Congress and the public that the war was entering its final phase, that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, that the pacification program was succeeding, that the South Vietnamese government was strengthening. General Westmoreland had returned from Vietnam to deliver optimistic assessments. The president had endorsed those assessments, and the machinery of official communication had been working overtime to convey a sense of steady progress. Then, in the first hours of the Tet holiday, NLF and North Vietnamese forces attacked more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously, including a penetration of the American embassy compound in Saigon that lasted for hours before being repelled. The images that came out of Saigon during those days, the fighting in the embassy courtyard, the general in civilian clothes executing a bound prisoner on a Saigon street, were images that could not be reconciled with the official narrative. Not because they showed something that had never happened before, but because they happened on camera, in a city that was supposed to be secure, in a war that was supposed to be nearly won. The credibility gap, which had been widening throughout the middle years of the war, became something more fundamental in the weeks after Tet. Not simply a gap between what officials said and what reporters observed, but a collapse of the basic claim that the people making decisions understood what was happening. Walter Cronkite's assessment, delivered on CBS News in February 1968, that the war was mired in stalemate, was not analytically sophisticated. But it captured something that the official statements had been obscuring for years. And its delivery by the most trusted journalist in America at the time had an effect that official statements and official denials could not reverse. The years between Tet and the final American withdrawal in 1975 were defined, at the institutional level, by a project of managed retreat that was described publicly as something else. Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while American troop levels declined, was presented as a strategy for achieving the original American objectives through a different means. In practice, it was an attempt to create conditions under which the United States could leave without the immediate appearance of having lost, while transferring the costs of continued failure to the South Vietnamese military and population. The South Vietnamese military, judged by many of the metrics that the American military used to assess it, improved substantially during the Vietnamization period. It was larger, better equipped, and more technically capable in 1972 than it had been in 1965. It also remained dependent on American air support and American logistics in ways that made its apparent capability misleading. The Easter Offensive of 1972, in which North Vietnamese forces launched a massive conventional attack across multiple fronts, demonstrated both things simultaneously. South Vietnamese ground forces held in some areas and collapsed in others, and the offensive was ultimately contained largely through the application of massive American air power, including B-52 strikes. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 ended American involvement in a way that both sides understood was not a peace, but a pause. The agreement allowed American prisoners of war to be returned, allowed American forces to withdraw, and created a ceasefire framework that neither side had any serious intention of respecting for long. The North Vietnamese agreed to the accords because they understood that the American domestic political situation made continued American military involvement unsustainable, and because the agreement did not require them to remove their forces from South Vietnam, meaning that when the fighting resumed, which it would, they would be better positioned than before. The South Vietnamese government signed because it had no choice. President Thieu understood what the agreement meant and said so privately. He had been given private assurances by the Nixon administration that the United States would respond with force if the North Vietnamese violated the accords. Those assurances were not transmitted to Congress, were not backed by formal commitments, and proved worthless when the North Vietnamese resumed major operations in 1975 and Congress declined to authorize further American military intervention. The final collapse came faster than almost anyone, including the North Vietnamese, had planned. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam did not fight as badly in most engagements in 1975 as its reputation suggested it would. There were units that fought with determination, holding positions against superior forces, suffering significant casualties in defensive ground they were ordered to hold. But the strategic situation had deteriorated past the point where tactical competence could reverse it. When the Central Highlands fell in March 1975, and the government in Saigon ordered a strategic withdrawal, the withdrawal became a rout, and the rout became a collapse. The Americans, who had advised the South Vietnamese military, who had spent years building institutions and training forces and developing capabilities, watched from a distance as those institutions and forces dissolved. The dissolution was not simply a military failure. It was the final manifestation of problems that had been present since the beginning and that had been reported in various forms by various people for years. The South Vietnamese government had never achieved the popular legitimacy that would have made its military sacrifice meaningful to the population it claimed to represent. The South Vietnamese military had been built to fight a war of attrition with American support, and had never developed the institutional resilience to fight a war of endurance without it. The pacification of the countryside had been, in large portions of the country, a statistical fiction maintained for the benefit of American officials who needed progress to report to Congress. None of this was unknown to the people involved. The after-action reports, the intelligence assessments, the dissenting cables, the studies produced by the Pentagon's own analytical offices, the reports filed by province advisors who wrote honestly about what they were seeing, all of this existed in the files, in the archives, in the accumulated documentation of 20 years of American involvement. What it demonstrates is not that the war was misunderstood, but that it was misrepresented by a system that had learned to produce the appearance of progress because the appearance of progress was what the system required, and because the system had no effective mechanism for holding itself accountable to the reality that its own documents described. The soldiers who served in Vietnam and came home to a country that did not know how to receive them carried knowledge that the official history was not prepared to incorporate. They knew things about the texture of the war, about what had been done and what had been left unreported, about the gap between the war as it had been fought and the war as it had been described, that were not accessible from outside. Some of them talked about it. Many did not. The silence that surrounded the war's veterans in the years after its end was not simply the country's failure to acknowledge sacrifice. It was also, in part, the silence of people who understood that the full accounting had not been made and would not be made, and who had learned in the war that the official accounting was not where truth lived. The files from that war contained documents that were never fully processed. Maps recovered from enemy positions that showed things the official maps did not show. After-action reports that were filed and forwarded and noted and never acted upon. Cables from the field that were received and read and placed in contexts that changed their meaning. Intelligence assessments that were produced and disseminated and cited selectively. Medical records of men who were treated for wounds and for conditions that the records describe in clinical language that does not convey what the conditions actually were. Personnel files of soldiers who were disciplined for reporting what they saw. Investigative reports that were initiated and then closed without findings that their initiating circumstances would seem to have required. The war contained a generation of men who were told repeatedly that what they were doing was meaningful, was succeeding, was serving a purpose that justified the cost. The evidence available to them in the villages they moved through and the firefights they survived and the rotations they completed did not support that claim. The adjustments they made to their understanding of the official explanations, the calibrations between what they were told and what they saw, the small daily negotiations between institutional loyalty and personal observation, were the real texture of the war, the part that did not appear in the briefings and did not generate the statistics and did not appear in the official histories. The Veterans Administration hospitals that received the survivors in the years after the war saw the effects of those adjustments. Men who had served in Vietnam presented at higher rates than veterans of other wars, with conditions that the medical system of the time had difficulty classifying. The constellation of symptoms that would later be described as post-traumatic stress disorder, the hypervigilance, the intrusive memories, the difficulty reintegrating into civilian patterns of behavior, the persistent sense that the familiar had become unreliable. These were, in many cases, not the residue of a single catastrophic event, but the accumulated effect of months of operating in an environment where the normal rules had been suspended, where the metrics had been false, where the explanations had not matched the experience, where the institutional language and the lived reality had occupied the same space without ever quite meeting. The war's psychological casualties were not recognized as such for years. They were attributed to individual weakness, to failure of character, to pre-existing conditions. The institution that had sent these men into an environment that produced their symptoms showed little interest in acknowledging the role its own structures and decisions had played in producing those symptoms. This was consistent with the general institutional posture toward accountability that had characterized the war throughout its history. The chemical defoliation program, conducted under the operational name Ranch Hand and producing the mixture known as Agent Orange, represents another dimension of the same story. The program was designed to deny the enemy concealment and to destroy crops in areas under enemy control. It was conducted on a massive scale with millions of gallons of herbicide sprayed across large portions of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia over more than a decade. The operational results were mixed and contested even at the time. What was less contested within the military and government, though it was not publicly disclosed, was the accumulating evidence that the herbicides being used were contaminated with dioxin, and that dioxin exposure had serious health consequences. That evidence was available internally from relatively early in the program. Studies conducted on laboratory animals had demonstrated dioxin's toxicity. Reports from Vietnamese medical personnel in exposed areas described birth defects and cancers at elevated rates. Some of the American personnel applying the herbicides were developing conditions consistent with toxic exposure. The public acknowledgement of Agent Orange's health effects on American veterans did not come until years after the war ended, and came only after sustained advocacy by veterans groups that had been dismissed or ignored for most of that period. The acknowledgement of its effects on the Vietnamese population, civilian and military, was even slower in coming and remains, in official American discourse, less than complete. The files on the program contained information about toxicity that was available long before the public acknowledgement. The gap between what was known internally and what was disclosed publicly followed the same pattern as every other dimension of the war. The bombing of Cambodia and Laos, conducted secretly during the Nixon administration, extended the pattern of the war into entirely new territories, both geographically and institutionally. The bombing of Cambodia, which began in 1969, was conducted under a menu of code names designed to conceal it from Congress and from the public. Military records were falsified. The sorties were logged as having been conducted in South Vietnam. Personnel who were aware of the actual targets were instructed not to discuss them. The program was not a deviation from standard operating procedure. It was standard operating procedure. The same logic of doing operationally what was politically impossible to acknowledge applied at a larger scale and with more systematic documentation destruction. The Cambodia bombing's effects on the country's political stability and the eventual rise of the Khmer Rouge is a matter of ongoing historical debate. What is not debated is that the bombing occurred, that it was concealed, that the concealment was systematic and deliberate, and that when it was eventually revealed by the reporting of Seymour Hersh and others, the response from the administration was to investigate the sources of the leak rather than the substance of what had been concealed. Laos was bombed even more heavily than Cambodia, and for longer. The Plain of Jars and the Ho Chi Minh Trail corridors through eastern Laos received more bombs per capita than any other place in the history of aerial warfare. The bombing was not entirely secret, as it was eventually acknowledged in congressional testimony, but its scale was consistently understated in public communications. The effects on the Laotian population, including the hundreds of thousands of cluster munitions that remain in the soil and continue to kill and maim civilians decades later, were not subjects of detailed public accounting during the war. The Phoenix program, the CIA-coordinated effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political and administrative network that supported the NLF's operations in the South, produced its own version of the same institutional pathologies. The program's stated objective was to dismantle the NLF's organizational structure by capturing or killing its members. The metric it used was the number of infrastructure members neutralized, a category that included capture, defection, and death. The incentive structure that the metric created was predictable. It rewarded numbers, and numbers could be produced in ways that had varying degrees of relationship to the stated objective. Local officials with quotas to meet, South Vietnamese police and military units working with American advisors, found that the fastest way to generate neutralizations was to identify individuals as infrastructure members and then kill them, since killing was faster and simpler than the evidentiary requirements of capture and prosecution. The result? was a program that, in some provinces and in some periods, functioned as a relatively targeted counterinsurgency operation, and in other provinces and periods functioned as a vehicle for score settling, the elimination of personal enemies, and the production of numbers that would satisfy supervisory requirements. The actual members of the VCI who were neutralized by the program, and there were many, represented a real degradation of the NLF's organizational capacity. The program's most honest advocates argued, with some justification, that it was more effective than most alternatives in targeting the political infrastructure rather than the military forces. But the program also killed people who were not members of the VCI, generated information through interrogation methods that were documented and reported, and that the official guidelines did not sanction, and created a political relationship between the American program and the South Vietnamese security services that was difficult to characterize as law enforcement in any recognizable sense. The documentation of these realities existed. The program's own internal evaluations noted the problems with casualty inflation. CIA officers in the provinces filed reports describing specific incidents. Congressional testimony, though guarded, raised questions. None of this produced systematic reform during the period when the program was operating at scale. What it produced was the same response that problematic information produced throughout the war: acknowledgement at the margin, adjustment at the edges, and continuation of the fundamental patterns. The men who carried out the Phoenix program at the operational level, the American advisors who worked with the provincial reconnaissance units, the CIA case officers who ran the intelligence networks, experienced the same fragmentation between official description and operational reality that characterized the wider war. They were doing things that the official descriptions made sound like law enforcement and counter-political operations. What they were actually doing was sometimes those things and sometimes something else, and the ability to maintain a stable moral understanding of one's own actions in that environment required either a kind of compartmentalization that itself left traces or a gradual erosion of the distinctions that the compartmentalization was supposed to maintain. The interrogation facilities associated with the program, the provincial interrogation centers that were part of the program's infrastructure in most provinces, were sites of documented abuse that the program's American supervisors knew about to varying degrees and responded to with varying levels of intervention. The official position was that the centers operated according to rules that prohibited torture. The operational reality in many centers was different. The information obtained from prisoners was used, and the methods used to obtain it were understood to include methods not sanctioned by the official guidelines, and this knowledge existed at levels of the chain of command that were high enough to constitute institutional knowledge rather than individual deviance. The records of the Peers Commission investigation, which followed My Lai and examined the broader question of war crimes in Vietnam, indicate that the pattern of unreported and inadequately investigated incidents extended far beyond the events of March 1968. The Commission found evidence of a systematic failure at multiple levels of command to take seriously reports of civilian casualties and property destruction. A pattern in which information was suppressed, investigations were foreclosed, and the institutional norm of protecting the reputation of the command took precedence over accountability for what had happened in the field. The Commission's full report was classified. Its findings were discussed in summary form, redacted for public release, and then allowed to recede from public attention as the war moved through its later phases and eventually ended. The question it raised, about the systemic character of the conduct it documented, was not answered. The answer would have required engaging with the relationship between institutional incentives, command climate, rules of engagement, operational environment, and individual behavior in ways that the institution was not prepared to engage with, because the engagement would have required acknowledging complicity at levels that went well above the lieutenant who was court-martialed. The Air Force pilots who flew the bombing missions over North Vietnam and Laos operated in their own institutional environment, one that had its own version of the same disconnects. The targets they struck were authorized through a process that involved both military and civilian officials. The White House in some periods actively managed the target list for rolling thunder, a practice that military commanders resented as civilian interference in operational matters, and that civilian officials maintained because they understood that the unrestricted target list the military wanted would have consequences that the political situation could not absorb. The pilots hit their targets, filed their after-action reports, and accumulated the statistics that were cited as evidence of progress. Some of them had clear senses that the overall campaign was not achieving what they were told it was achieving, based on the fact that they kept returning to strike the same targets or the same target types, that the traffic on the routes they were trying to interdict did not appear to be declining, that the air defenses over North Vietnam were becoming more capable rather than less so as the campaign continued. These observations were not systematically reported upward. They were part of the informal knowledge of the pilots who were flying, knowledge that circulated within squadrons and wings, but that did not translate into formal assessments that would have complicated the official narrative. The Navy pilots operating from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin and the pilots flying from bases in Thailand developed similar cultures of informal knowledge, maintained alongside and largely separate from the official reporting structure. The Tonkin Gulf incidents that had provided the legislative justification for the major American escalation in 1964, the claimed attacks on American destroyers that led to the Tonkin Gulf resolution, were known within certain circles of the Naval Command to be considerably more ambiguous than the public account presented. The second attack, the one that triggered the actual resolution, was particularly questionable, with the crew of the destroyer USS Maddox itself uncertain during and after the engagement whether any attack had in fact occurred. That uncertainty existed in the reporting chain. It was not allowed to complicate the political momentum toward escalation that the administration was managing. The classified documents that Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the New York Times and Washington Post in 1971, subsequently known as the Pentagon Papers, provided public confirmation of patterns that had been suspected by some and known by fewer. The study, commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, traced the decision-making history of American involvement in Vietnam from its origins through the mid-1960s, and what it showed, across thousands of pages of internal documents, was that the gap between public statements and private assessments had been systematic, persistent, and known to the senior officials making the public statements. The administration's response to the publication of the Pentagon Papers was to seek an injunction against further publication and to pursue criminal charges against Ellsberg, neither of which ultimately succeeded. The argument that the paper's publication endangered national security was at considerable odds with the fact that the papers were a historical study covering a period already several years in the past, whose main effect was to document that the public had been systematically misled about a war in which tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese had died. The determination to prosecute the leak, rather than account for what the leak revealed, was consistent with the institutional logic that had characterized the war throughout. The men who came home from Vietnam and encountered the anti-war movement, the protests and the demonstrations, and the returning veterans who testified about what they had seen and done, were navigating a situation that had no clear institutional support. The military did not provide frameworks for processing the moral complexities of what many of them had done. The VA did not have adequate resources or, for years, adequate clinical frameworks for treating what they were experiencing. The public culture of the time, which was deeply polarized around the war, offered either uncritical glorification of service or a kind of condemnation that many veterans experienced as directed at them personally, rather than at the policies that had sent them. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the organization that organized the Winter Soldier hearings in Detroit in 1971, where veterans testified publicly about their own actions and those of their units, represented an attempt to break through the official silence and to put on the record the reality of what the war had contained. The hearings were attended by hundreds of veterans. The testimony was specific, detailed, and included accounts of actions that constituted war crimes under any reasonable interpretation of the laws of war. The response from the military establishment and from much of the political class was to question the credibility of the witnesses, to suggest the hearings were staged or manipulated, and to decline to investigate the specific incidents described. The pattern held, the documentation existed, the testimony was on record, the specific incidents were named and located and dated, and the institutional response was to manage the information rather than to account for it. Some of the individuals who testified had their claims investigated and found to be unverifiable. Others described incidents that were consistent with documented operational patterns in the areas and periods they described. The aggregate effect of the testimony, as a picture of the war's character, was consistent with what the classified records, the internal investigations, and the accumulating body of journalistic reporting had already established. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, did not end the accounting, though it ended the war. The images of the evacuation from the rooftops of the South Vietnamese officials and military personnel and civilians left behind, of the helicopters being pushed into the South China Sea to make room on the carrier decks, were images of an ending that had been prepared for and dreaded, and by most of the people who had been involved, anticipated for years. The question that they raised, about what it had all been for, was a question that the institutional framework was not equipped to answer. The answer that the institution eventually provided, after years of study and memorialization and debate, was the lesson of Vietnam, that American forces should not be committed to a conflict without clear objectives, sustained public support, and a defined exit strategy. This lesson, the so-called Vietnam Syndrome, was a real lesson, derived from real experience, and it shaped American military policy for decades. It was also, in a sense, another form of the same displacement that had characterized the war throughout. The lesson focused on strategic and political conditions for successful military action. It addressed less directly the questions about what had happened inside the institution, about what the body counts, and the falsified reports and the covert programs and the free fire zones had meant for the institution's relationship to truth and to accountability, and what the consequences of that relationship had been for the people, American and Vietnamese, whose lives it had shaped. The Vietnamese casualties, military and civilian north and south, remain a subject of considerable historical uncertainty, which is itself a fact worth dwelling on. Estimates of the total war dead range from roughly 1 million to more than 3 million Vietnamese, depending on the methodology and the scope of the counting. The uncertainty is not simply a product of the war's chaos, though the chaos was real. It is also a product of the same documentary problems that characterize the war throughout. Incomplete records, contested counts, official figures that served institutional purposes, and the absence of the systematic documentation that would have been required to produce reliable numbers. The Agent Orange exposure, the unexploded ordnance, the environmental contamination of large portions of the Vietnamese countryside continued to produce casualties for decades after the ceasefire and continue to do so. The second and third generation effects of dioxin exposure, the elevated rates of birth defects in affected communities, the cluster munition injuries that claim victims every year in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia represent a dimension of the war's ongoing cost that receives intermittent attention and systematic neglect in equal measure. The American veterans whose service ended without resolution, who came home to an ambiguous country from an ambiguous war and were asked to carry privately what the country was not prepared to acknowledge publicly, spent decades doing that carrying. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans was elevated compared to veterans of other conflicts, though the specific magnitude and its relationship to combat exposure versus other variables remains contested. The rates of substance abuse, of homelessness, of physical illness attributable to toxic exposures, all represent a cost that was not included in the official calculations when the decisions to commit and to escalate were made. The memorials that were eventually built and the official acknowledgements that were eventually offered arrived in a context where the full accounting had still not been made. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, with its reflective black granite and its 58,000 names, is one of the most affecting monuments in America. It achieves its effect precisely through the absence of the official language, through the refusal to explain or justify, through the unmediated presence of the names of people who died. The design, chosen over the objections of those who wanted something more heroic, captured something true about the war by refusing the vocabulary that the official narrative had made untrustworthy. The operational records of the war, the after-action reports and the intelligence assessments and the planning documents and the target lists and the investigation files and the Phoenix program casualty counts and the ranch hand flight records and the Hamlet evaluation system databases exist in the National Archives and in the record centers of the military services. They are available to historians and are being worked through by scholars who are producing a more complete picture of what the war contained than has been available in any single previous account. That work continues. The maps found inside captured enemy positions. The ones that showed a different picture than the official maps are part of that record. They showed friendly areas that were not friendly, pacified areas that were not pacified, secure routes that were not secure. They showed, in the spare language of military cartography, the gap between the war that was being reported and the war that was being fought. They were evidence, and like most of the evidence generated by the war, they were processed by a system that was more comfortable with the comfortable picture than with what the evidence actually showed. The war did not end in 1975 for the people it had most directly affected. For the Vietnamese, it continued in various forms through the subsequent years of reunification, re-education camps, economic dislocation, and the long process of reconstruction. For the Americans who had served, it continued in the ways that serious experience continues, shaping the perception of subsequent events, surfacing in unexpected contexts, demanding forms of processing that the culture had not prepared them for and the institution had not provided. For the institution itself, the war continued in the sense that the questions it had raised about accountability, about the relationship between official narrative and operational reality, about the uses and misuses of metrics and reporting systems and chain of command information flow, were questions that had been partially absorbed into doctrine and partially deflected into the language of lessons learned. The systems that had produced the body count culture were revised. The systems that had produced the strategic Hamlet programs, false statistics, were revised. The systems that had enabled covert programs to operate outside normal oversight were constrained. Whether the underlying institutional dynamics had changed in ways that would prevent the same patterns from recurring in different circumstances is a question that subsequent history has provided its own answers to. The last American combat units left Vietnam in March 1973. The last Americans were evacuated from Saigon in April 1975. The war had lasted in its various phases from the early 1950s through that April day. It had consumed approximately 58,000 American lives, roughly 300,000 American wounded, and an order of magnitude more Vietnamese lives on both sides of the conflict, and across the extended theater that included Cambodia and Laos. It had cost, by various estimates, more than $500 billion in current values. It had altered the internal politics of the United States in ways that are still being worked through. It had demonstrated with considerable specificity what happens when an institution substitutes the management of information for the production of truth, and it had not produced a reckoning with that demonstration that was proportionate to its scale. The files are still there. The names on the wall are still there. The ordnance in the soil of the Plain of Jars is still there. The dioxin in the sediment of the Mekong Delta is still there. The men who came home and did not find what they needed to find are still there, in diminishing numbers, some of them. The question of what it meant is still open, not because the facts are unavailable, but because the facts have never been assembled into an accounting that the institution is prepared to fully own. The war continued for 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords, with no American forces engaged in combat, its outcome already determined by the conditions that had been created over the preceding decade, until the last helicopter lifted off the roof of the embassy and the gates of the presidential palace opened.